What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 9 of the We Fought Back series, where today I will be talking about the New York Conspiracy of 1741. The Conspiracy of 1741, also known as the Slave Insurrection of 1741, was a purported plot by slaves and poor whites in the British colony of New York in 1741 to revolt and level New York City with a series of fires. Historians disagree as to whether such a plot existed and, if there was one, its scale. During the court cases, the prosecution kept changing the grounds of accusation, ending with linking the insurrection to a popish plot by Spaniards and other Catholics. In 1741, Manhattan had the second largest slave population of any city in the 13 colonies after Charleston, South Carolina. Rumors of a conspiracy arose against the background of economic competition between poor whites and slaves, a severe winter war between Britain and Spain with heightened anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish feelings, and recent slave revolts in South Carolina and St. John in the Caribbean. In March and April of 1741, a series of 13 fires erupted in Lower Manhattan, the most significant one within the walls of Fort George, then the home of the governor. After another fire at a warehouse, a slave was arrested after having been seen fleeing it. A 16-year-old Irish indentured servant by the name of Mary Burton, arrested in a case of stolen goods, testified against the others as participants in a supposedly growing conspiracy of poor whites and blacks to burn the city, kill the white men, take the white women for themselves, and elect a new king and governor. In the spring of 1741, fear gripped Manhattan as fires burned across all the inhabited areas of the island. The suspected culprits, including hundreds of New York slaves, free blacks, and lower-class whites, 172 of whom were arrested and tried for conspiracy to burn the town and murder its white inhabitants. As in the Salem witch trials, a few witnesses implicated many other suspects. In the end, 34 people were executed, 30 of whom were black men. They included 17 black men, 2 white men, and 2 white women who were hanged, as well as 13 black men burnt at the stake. The bodies of 2 supposed ringleaders, Caesar, a slave, and John Hewson, a white cobbler and tavern keeper, were gibbeted. Their corpses were left to rot in public. Another 84 men and women faced transportation to the brutal conditions of Caribbean slavery, while 7 white men were pardoned on condition of entering permanent exile from New York. With the increase of enslaved Africans in New York during the early decades of the 18th century, there were both real revolts and periodic fears in the white community about revolts. Fears about slavery were used by different political factions to fan other tensions as well. By 1741, slaves comprised 1 in 5 of New York's total population of 10,000. It was the second largest slave population of any city in British North America after that of Charleston, South Carolina. Between 1687 and 1741, a slave plot was discovered on average every 2.5 years. Some residents remembered the New York Slave Revolt of 1712, when more than 20 slaves met to destroy property and abuses in retaliation for the injustices they had suffered. One of the slaves, called Kofi, set fire to his master's outhouse when townspeople gathered to put it out. The slaves attacked the crowd, killing 9 whites and injuring 6. The governor tried and executed 21 slaves. With the increase of slaves in New York, poor whites had to compete economically. Some slaveholders were artisans who taught their slaves their trade. They could subcontract their work and underbid other white artisans. This created racial and economic tension between the slaves and the competing white craftsmen. The governor of New York in 1737 told the legislature the artificers complained, and with too much reason, of the pernicious custom of breeding slaves to trade, whereby the honest industrious tradesmen are reduced to poverty for want of employ, and many of them forced to leave us to seek their living in other countries. Some whites went out of business because of this. The winter of 1740 to 1741 was a miserable period for the poor in the city. An economic depression contributed to declining food and fuel supply, aggravated by record low temperatures and snowfall. Many people were in danger of starving and freezing to death. These conditions caused many denizens, especially the poor whites and slaves, to grow resentful of the government. The tension between the whites and blacks was great. A mere hint of restiveness among black New Yorkers could throw whites into a near panic. In addition, Britain experienced increased hostilities with Spain, which added the anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish feelings by the authorities. In 1691, the British Crown ordered all New York officials to swear oaths under the Test Act. These oaths consisted of a series of declarations against the authority of the Catholic Church and its religious practices. All potential office holders were obliged to swear that they had not received privilege from the Pope. As tension between England and Spain escalated, the Test Act was determined to be too lenient for Catholics. By 1700, the New York anti-priest law utterly outlawed the presence of Catholic priests under penalty of life imprisonment. In 1739, war broke out between the English and Spanish. The War of Jenkins' Ear, which lasted from 1739 to 1748, was initiated after Spanish coast guards unlawfully boarded the ship of Robert Jenkins, a British merchant, and severed his ear. This incident was particularly notable because the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht gave British a 30-year right to supply an unlimited number of slaves to Spanish colonies with an additional 500 tons of goods each year. At the time, Spain was frequently viewed by slaves in Anglophone colonies as a liberator due to the fact that Spanish had offered freedom to any slave who joined their cause. To attack Cuba, the British recruited soldiers from New York and reduced the number of troops normally kept there. The upper classes were nervous, and tensions during the winter reminded them of the times of the slave revolt of 1712. The government banned slave meetings on street corners. They limit slaves in groups up to 3, but allowed 12 at funerals. The government reduced other rights of assembly and movement. Initially tackling the problem of stolen goods in Hewson's Tavern, the city council decided to launch an investigation. They turned it over to Daniel Horsmanden, the city recorder and one of 3 justices on the provincial Supreme Court. Horsmanden set up a grand jury that he directed to investigate whites who sold liquor to blacks, men like John Hewson. Given legal practice then and his own inclinations, he exercised great influence in interrogations and directly in the grand jury's investigations. John Hewson was a poor, illiterate cobbler who came to New York from Yonkers in mid-1730s with his wife, daughter, and mother-in-law. Unable to find work, he opened a tavern. His neighbors were offended because he sold to clients they considered unsavory. In 1738, Hewson opened a new tavern when he moved to the Hudson River waterfront near the Trinity Churchyard. It soon became a rendezvous point for slaves, poor whites, free blacks, and soldiers. The elite were nervous about such lower class type socializing together. Hewson Place also was a center of trade and stolen property. City slaves laughingly referred to his place as Oswego after the Indian trading post on Lake Ontario. Although the constables watched his place constantly, they failed to catch Hewson for thievery. In February, 2 weeks before the first fire, Hewson was arrested for receiving stolen goods from slaves, Caesar and Prince, who were also jailed. Caesar, Prince, and Cuffy were considered part of the Geneva Club, named after an incident in which they stole some Geneva or Dutch gin. The slaves were punished by whipping. Horsmanden, one of the 3 justices on the court and leader of an investigation, pressured 16-year-old indentured servant Mary Burton to testify against her master Hewson on theft charges. While a grand jury heard that case, the first of 13 suspicious fires broke out. On March 18, 1731, Governor George Clark's house in Fort George caught fire, and soon the church connected to his house was ablaze too. People tried to save it, but the fire soon grew beyond control. The fire threatened to spread to another building where all the city documents were kept. The governor ordered the windows smashed and documents thrown out to save them. Later, the practice was to keep them in the city hall. A week later, another fire broke out but was put out quickly. The same thing happened the next week at a warehouse. 3 days later, a fire broke out in a cow stable. On the next day, a person walking past a wealthy neighborhood saw coals by hay in a stable and put them out, saving the neighborhood. As the numbers of fires increased, so did the suspicion that the fires were not accident but planned arson. On April 6, a round of 4 fires broke out and a black man was spotted running away. A white man yelled out, "A Negro, a Negro." The man's cry was taken up quickly by a crowd and soon turned to "The Negroes are rising." The capture the runaway slave, Cuffy. He was jailed. Within a few days, 100 slaves were jailed. Horace Mandan put a lot of pressure on Burton to talk about the fires. Finally, Burton said the fires were a conspiracy between blacks and poor whites to burn down the town. Horace Mandan was pleased with her testimony, but was convinced that Burton knew more about the conspiracy than she had told him. He threatened to throw her in jail if she did not tell him more, so she testified further. There was rising fear about slaves and poor whites combining for insurrection. Burton swore the 3 members of the Geneva Club met frequently at Houston's home and talked about burning the fort in town, and the Houstons had agreed to help them. Another person suspected in the fires was Margaret Cerebrio, alias Sailing Bird, alias Carrie, commonly known as Peggy or the new-founded Irish Beauty. She was a prostitute who serviced blacks. The room she lived in was paid for by Caesar, with whom she had a child. Although Burton's testimony did not prove that any crime had been committed, the grand jury was so afraid that more fires would occur that they decided to believe her. The Board of Inquiry requested the Lieutenant Governor to issue a proclamation offering a reward to anyone providing information leading to the conviction of anyone setting fire to any dwelling or storehouse in the city. £100 to a white person, £45 to a free black or Indian, and $20 in freedom to a slave. Such prices attracted more testimony. On May 2nd, the court found Caesar and Prince guilty of burglary and condemned them to death. The next day, 7 barns caught fire. 2 blacks were caught and immediately burned at the stake. On May 6th, the Houstons and Peggy were found guilty of burglary charges. Peggy, in fear of her life, decided to talk. Some of the blacks who had been imprisoned in the dungeons also decided to talk. 2 who did not talk were Caesar and Prince, who were hanged on May 11th. Having gathered witnesses, Horace Mandan started the trials. Kofi or Cuffy and another slave, Quaco or Quack, were the first to be tried. They were convicted, although each of their masters defended them. Respectable white men whose testimony normally would have been given considerable weight, they stated that each of the slaves had been at home the evening in question. The slaves were convicted anyway. Immediately before sentencing to be hanged on May 30th, they confessed and identified dozens of other so-called conspirators. Moore asked to save them as future witnesses, but the officers of the court decided against it because of the rage of the crowd. Each of the slaves was hanged. More trials followed quickly. The trials and testimonies in courtrooms were filled with conflicting evidence. Both Houston's and Peggy Carey were tried on June 4th. They were sentenced to hang 8 days later. At the height of the hysteria, half of the city's male slaves over the age of 16 were implicated in the plot and jailed. Arrests, trials, and executions continued throughout the summer. The epidemic of mutual incrimination reached such proportions that officials were forced to suspend circuit courts for the rest of 1741. The jail simply couldn't hold no more people. An anonymous letter was sent to the city of New York, cautioning them against the epidemic of suspicion and executions, as the writer claimed to have seen in the Salem witch trials. 5 men known as the Spanish Negroes were amongst those arrested. Dark-skinned Spanish sailors who had been sold into slavery by a privateer. They were contended they were full Spanish citizens and unfairly enslaved. Because Britain was at war with Spain, this did not earn them much sympathy. It even raised suspicions against them as infiltrators. The British colonists were worried about anyone with Spanish and Catholic ties. The 5 Spanish blacks were convicted and hanged. At the height of the trials, hysteria, Horace Mandan believed he had found an irrefutable link between the Papists and fires. As the investigations wore on, Horace Mandan also came to believe that a man named John Urey was responsible. Urey had just arrived in town and had been working as a school teacher and a private tutor. He was an expert in Latin, which was enough to make him a suspect by less educated Protestants as possibly being a Roman Catholic priest. Horace Mandan arrested him on suspicion of being a priest and Spanish secret agent. Burton suddenly remembered that Urey had been one of the plotters of the conspiracy and testified against him, and that's remembered in quotations. Urey was put on trial, and his defense was that he was a dissenter from the Church of England but not a Catholic priest and had no knowledge of any conspiracy. But at the time of the trial, Horace Mandan had received a warning from the governor of Georgia that Spanish agents were coming to burn all the considerable towns in New England. James Oglethorpe, founder and governor of Georgia, sent word to prosecutor Joseph Murray that the Spanish were planning a secret invasion of the British colonies. A party of our Indians returned the 8th instant from war against the Spaniards. They had an engagement with a party of Spanish horse just by St. Augustine, and they brought 1 Spaniard prisoner to me. Some intelligence I had of a villainous design of a very extraordinary nature, and if true, very important, viz. That the Spaniards had employed emissaries to burn all the magazines in considerable towns in the English North America, thereby to prevent the subsisting of the great expedition and fleet in the West Indies. And for this purpose, many priests were employed and who pretended to be physicians, dancing masters, and other kinds of occupations, and under that pretense to get admittance and confidence in families. Oglethorpe's letter left little doubt that the colony was part of an international conspiracy, one which not only planned to infiltrate and destroy the city of New York, but also to engage its Protestant citizens in religious warfare. Catholicism, as it is now deeply tied to both the Spanish and slaves, came to be perceived as a greater threat than ever before in the colony. This added to suspicions about Urey, and the teacher was convicted. He was hanged on the last day of August. Gradually, the fears died down. When Burton and other witnesses began to accuse members of the upper class and family members of the judges as conspirators, the case became a major embarrassment to Horace Mandan. In addition, the political leadership of the city was changing. The case was finally closed. Those slaves and whites still in jail were released. By the end of the trials, 161 blacks and 20 whites had been arrested from May 11 to August 29, 1741. 17 blacks and 4 whites were convicted and hanged. 13 blacks were burned at the stake, and 70 blacks were banished from the state of New York. 7 whites were also deported. The following year, Mary Burton finally received her reward of £100 from the city, which she used to buy her freedom from indenture and had money left over. The executions were conducted near the poorhouse at the north end of the city in its boundary of Chambers Street. North there was the African burial ground, which was rediscovered in 1991 during survey work for construction at 26 Federal Plaza in Lower Manhattan. In consultation with the African American community, the remains of 400 people, including children, were removed and studied. They were reburied in a formal ceremony, likely the site of up to 20,000 African burials during the colonial period. It had been designated as a National Historic Landmark. Mary Burton, Sarah Hewson, and Peggy Carey were 3 women whose testimony was instrumental in the outcomes of the trials during the slave revolt. Burton's most notable accusations were against John Urey. Hewson also gave testimony to Urey, however, her testimony only came once, threatened with death. Carey, when first confronted, denied everything, but later, in hopes of being pardoned, she said she had been involved and shifted the location of the conspiracy itself. There is some suggestion that the 1741 New York panic may have also led to burnings at the stake of individuals from New Jersey's enslaved population, as then Essex County records suggest, according to accounts written in the 19th and early 20th centuries, that locals were openly reimbursed for the cost of irons and wood for pyres. However, the New York executions took place from May through August of 1741. While the records regarding irons and wood may have been in early years, there is evidence of the burning to death of an individual in August 1735, as well as 2 individuals burned to death on the banks of the Hackensack River on May 5th, 1741. Outside of the 1741 panic, other such executions occurred. Under a New Jersey law passed in 1713 that authorized slave punishment by burning at the stake, it is also reported numerous individuals were so executed prior to the Revolution. And that is going to conclude episode 9 of the We Fought Back series, where I talked about, yet again, the New York conspiracy of 1741. If you would like to recap on previous episodes, I have created a We Fought Back playlist where you can catch up on all the episodes or just rewatch them at your own leisure. And be sure to tune in next Wednesday, same time, same place at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, where I will be doing episode 10 of the We Fought Back series. Be safe, be one.